Welcome to the panel, The Future of Regulatory Science Advice, Adaptive Tech Regulation, and How to Do This. For this panel, you guessed it, we'll project ourselves into the future. But first, we need to take a look at the present. Many of the biggest current debates in very different areas of science, such as vaccines or artificial intelligence, stem out of regulation science. Is this the most volatile area for democracy today? This panel will give some answers and lots of food for thought. Please welcome your moderator, Marc, Chair of the Department of Geography, Environment and Geomatics at the University of Ottawa, and the founding director of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. Today's speakers are Marina Kaljurand, member of the European Parliament and of the Science and Technology Options Assessment Committee. Lassina Zerbo, Executive Secretary Emeritus of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. Yoshua Bengio, founder and scientific director of Mila, Quebec AI Institute, and full professor at the University of Montreal. And finally, Mohammad Adeel, diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Pakistan.
Thank you. Okay, let me start. Thanks very much. Thanks to INGSA for organizing this awesome panel. It's truly international. We have people here from Europe, North America, Africa, South Asia. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I was asked to give a brief introduction, and I thought I will give you a very brief anecdote to just illustrate the status of regulation, I think, that you get in society. I had an opportunity to get a job in regulation, and I told my friends, and one of my friends said, regulation, boring, next job, next opportunity. He thought it would be a very poor choice. I did take the job, and then I had, during this job at the university, I had an opportunity to talk to a leading professional in policy in Canada. And he said, yeah, I spent my whole life in policy, but now that I'm at the end of my career, I wish I had spent more time in regulation. And I think it illustrates that regulation is really big. It employs a lot of, at least in Canada, a lot of public servants. It's very important, a legal instrument. But a lot of people find policy strategy far more interesting. So here we are to convince you that there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in regulation. I just want to, for the benefit of the attendees, just read the general framing of INGSA. So that is about the future of regulation. And INGSA prepared 3 questions that I want to read. The first one is, does the regulatory science have difficulty keeping up with the pace of technological change or in engaging with evolving societal values? Second, what changes might be needed for regulatory science to support decision-making in our troubled democracies? And lastly, how is regulatory science structured and practiced? Provide examples from your specific sectors. So I think that's a great way to start. We'll start with your sector expertise, which is very varied. And then we'll see how far we can go into generalizing insights. So let me start with Professor Bengio. Joshua, you suggested in your think piece that the approach to regulation should shift from the status quo and become more adaptive and preventive. And you stress transparency in particular. For example, legislators should clarify what information on AI algorithms needs to be documented, and legislators should also enforce this request through independent monitoring. So I'm just curious how you see how this actually is going to happen. Is your community of AI practitioners ready for that kind of new move in regulation? And also, how would you go about getting the legislators motivated to actually take this policy direction? Over to you.
Thanks, Marc. Well, I think it depends who you talk to. The AI experts, the AI scientists, whether they're in academia or industry, generally agree that we need more regulation. And they understand it's important even for the survival of the field, that would prevent misuse of technologies like AI. Now, of course, if you talk to some of the people who are representing companies, to politicians, lobbyists, and so on, they want to minimize any kind of government intervention. I think it's a mistake. But yeah, there is resistance. However, I think at the level of, let's say, rational discourse, which we find among the AI experts and social scientists who are studying AI, there's close to consensus that we have to do these things. Otherwise, the backlash from the population and politicians could actually hurt more the development of the technology than if we do the right thing in terms of, you know, being aligned with our humanist values and general kind of human rights and so on, than if we just leave it to the law of the jungle.
So you think the legislators would be motivated and they would see that logic? Yeah.
Yes, and it's going to take some time because the whole IT, you know, information technology field has been left out of regulation up to now. The lobbyists have succeeded in convincing governments that it would be a bad idea to do that. In many countries, of course, the US has been playing a leadership role. But if you look around, all of the industrial sectors where the public is potentially at risk if things are not done right, have strong regulations. So, you know, think about airlines or transportation in general, pharmaceutical and so on. There's no reason why we wouldn't have something like this in the IT sector, and delaying it is dangerous.
Okay. Well, let me move to Marina, who has a lot of experience in legislation, being a member of the European Parliament and specifically the panel for the future of science and technology. So the question I thought I would ask you in advance, but you can also respond to Yoshua if you like. Is there a general sense that legislators and perhaps regulators and maybe the courts even are outpaced by technology? Is that a sense that that this is real? And is there also, do you see an appetite to work internationally on this issue if it exists?
Well, thank you, Marc. And before going to your question, I'd also like to say that how happy I am to participate in this discussion. I'm in Estonia on a remote island in the Baltic Sea. I'm so happy to see people from different geographical locations. And here we are. It's the ICT revolution that came to stay. It's the reality. I agree to many things that Yoshua said about regulation. I'm a lawyer by education and I'm a politician, which means that I understand the importance of law, including international law, but I also understand the importance of legally not binding political norms, codes of conduct, which are also kind of regulation. I'm a believer in good regulation because I think that we need clarity. We need clarity to avoid gray zones. We need clarity to know and understand what we're aiming at, what is whose responsibility, accountability, and so on. But coming from Europe, we love to regulate. So I would argue that sometimes we are over-regulating. So that if, for me, less regulation is better than more, and bad regulation is worse than no regulation. But as I said, this is a new field. We're just getting adjusted to it. And I see very different speeds and different processes. I come from Estonia, where we are famous for our e-lifestyle. We've been online now for almost 30 years, online voting, online everything, thousands of services. So for us, it was very logical to regulate with laws and regulations the behavior online. So the AI strategy was adopted in 2019. I have also had the international experience, and I would argue that in the United Nations, we are not ready to regulate in a binding form. We have ideological divisions, they are there. I'm speaking as the former expert on ICT and as the former member of the Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. So UN has its role, and globally there is some role, awareness raising, educational, capacity building, confidence building, but we are not ready to regulate by international law, by new conventions. And finally, I'm also a strong believer in Europe. And I think that when Yoshua said that not much is done globally and US is a leader, then it comes to my mind. But think about the European example of protection of privacy, GDPR. I see that we are setting norms there that can be followed globally. And I do hope that with the AI package, we will also be, we Europeans, we will also be able to set some examples globally.
Well, thank
you. I agree, by the way. I think the role that Europe is playing in this game is super important. And I'm generally happy with the recent proposal for AI regulation in Europe.
Well, thank you. So let's move to the international question. So Marina, you indicated one way to get to international standards is to set start somewhere, and then maybe the best standard will be adopted. Another approach is to negotiate right from the outset internationally, for example, climate change, or Lassina can speak on nuclear treaties, which are extremely important, still on, it's not over. And I'm would be very happy to hear your perspective, Lassina, on how to go about starting internationally when it comes to technologies which could become, which are of international interest or could be at the level of a risk of extinction, as Yoshua put in his think piece. Over to you.
Thank you, Marc, and thanks to Joshua and Marina to have kicking this discussion. I think if I agree with most of the points they mentioned, I wanted to pick on something that Marina talked about when she talked about setting norms that can be followed globally. I would say to start at the international level, there is an importance in being inclusive. Inclusiveness is key in getting norms that are set that could be globally applied or adhered to. In the example of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, you know that this is a discussion that has started in the 50s, and with technical expertise that was basically into how to discriminate between nuclear tests and earthquake. And a set of technology was put forward. But today, many developing countries are arguing the fact that some other aspects should have been included in the discussion at the outset. And that's why it is important when you talk about international law to have everyone involved at the outset, to build capacity, to develop capacity, to get people to understand what it's talked about, what is the vision behind it, and what we're trying to achieve before having them as an international norm that people would adhere to. One thing that I've seen at international level that is creating problem is when, a group of people not globally represented sit together, be it international, artificial international, or biotechnology, or the pandemic that we're discussing today, and then come up with norms that they want everyone to follow. So you can get people to follow, adhere to the norm if they see it applicable to their reality. So the only way to get them involved is to get them be part of the discussion, part of the problem solving, and then you'll get yourself in a situation where you are more inclusive, more participative, and then get the adherence of the international community to be more global and universal.
Let me just ask Mohammed on the question of international harmonization. So biotechnology is one example. It was also very much discussed for pesticides, which was the big topic before biotech. You've put in you argue in your think piece that it is very important to work globally, to try to achieve international approaches, and you also point out that it's very important to keep over-regulation as a risk in mind too, not just a risk for the direct risk for the technology itself. So would you like to just comment from that vantage point on what has been said so far?
Yeah, thank you, Marc. It's a privilege to be here. So as has been discussed earlier as well, the need for inclusive reform and the element of institutional drift, that technology outpaces regulations. So if you look at biotechnology and you compare it to AI, both are considered as new and emerging technology. But on one hand, ICTs, they are deregulated to a large extent, and biotech, which has been around for 20 to 25 years, there's a whole regime of regulations. And not only that, but there's also a transatlantic divide as well. So EU comes up with its precautionary principle, and there is a pro-innovation approach. So this is where there's a clash of norms as well. So it's important, as has been pointed out earlier, to use institutional build-up to bring norms forward, and then countries that don't have capacity to become part of the process. And biotech provides an important element of addressing food security and climate change. And those innovations, if they are they are over-regulated, countries that are poor or less developed, they will not be able to reap benefits out of it. So harmonization provides us that it's an important institutional pillar. It allows countries to bring norms together, and it is not necessary because absolute harmonization may be a utopia, but discussing and building an inclusive platform that brings natural sciences and social sciences together. Because in the case of, also in AI as well, when we discuss bias, same is the case with biotechnology as well. There are silos, and which is why we need science diplomacy at the international level to bring forward those values. The social sciences bringing in socioeconomic considerations, and the natural sciences bringing in their innovation. So what you need is a multi-stakeholder engagement, and which is why harmonization is a good slogan to bring people together.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm curious what you see as viable platforms or mechanisms, structures that are already in place to work on science diplomacy or international regulation. What do you see as the starting point? Or if you don't know of a starting point, do you think we need to invent a mechanism by which science diplomacy can really take off? Any of you?
Well, I'm involved in the Global Partnership on AI, also known as GPA, that has, I think, around 19 countries right now, discussing about policy and technology for AI. I'm co-chairing a working group on the responsible AI development. And so these kinds of discussions that we are having today are happening at the international level. OECD also has done a lot of work that I think could benefit from wider discussions. And the question of inclusivity of countries around the world, around the planet, is quite present in those discussions. So I think to some extent this is happening, and I agree we probably don't have what it takes to reach a perfect consensus at the global level. But I think nonetheless those discussions are having an impact. Many countries are asking themselves, what should I do? And they send their experts to these discussions. They send their representatives. So I think it is helping to harmonize, even though each country is doing whatever they want. And that's not, so I don't think there's a contradiction between having these discussions and having countries or like the EU, for example, going forward with their regulation. I think that it's a dynamic thing. And the social norms are changing. As I said, in the scientific community of AI research and scientists and engineers, the social norms have been changing very rapidly in the last few years. So if you had asked 3 or 4 years ago, people in the field would basically just, what? they didn't really realize there could be a problem with the social impact of the technology, at least most people, right? And now it's, there's not a single AI conference where this topic is not discussed. So the awareness has increased greatly, and it's, we're approaching a consensus. So that's, I think, very good. Now the problem, I think the obstacle is there's always going to be a mismatch between the profit motive of companies and the public interest. And that's where governments have to step up and start pushing for things that are important for the public. That's their role.
Marina, you used the word competition when you spoke. I was just curious how you see, working at European context is already international, but you also worked on the United Nations. Do you think competition is always in the room? Is that something you, like the white elephant that people are dancing around, or is that something that can be managed?
First of all, I very much agree with what Lassina, Mohammed and Yoshua have already said about inclusiveness. I will start with that. It's crucial. And I would argue that one of the difficulties today is that it's not in the DNA of governments to cooperate with others. Because for centuries, governments were those who were deciding unilaterally all security questions, all most important questions. Now with the rise of ICTs, they have to change. The governments have to change their mindset. They have to start listening to others. And it's really good when we understand scientists. But Yoshua, for years, you IT people were speaking the language we didn't understand. I think it's finally changing. We're now in the same room. Academics, diplomats, politicians. For years, we were in separate rooms. We were not understanding each other's language. So I think that we are at the stage where we, politicians, listen more and more to scientists, because finally we understood that with all the matters dealing with ICTs, being in cybersecurity, AI, we just can't be successful if we do not do it all together. So public-private partnership has moved from being just a politically correct slogan to a real working mechanism, not in all cases, but in many. Now, as to the possible platforms, I've been dealing mainly with cybersecurity. Now in the European Parliament, it's more also AI. And I have to say that we have to look into what we have. So for example, when we discuss the future of the internet, we have IGF. We have other platforms. We have platforms with the United Nations. I don't want to underestimate the role of the United Nations. What I wanted to say is that when we look about international law, we have to look into what we have already. Majority was written before internet was discovered. So now we have to look into how to apply the existing international law norms also to the use of ICTs to the cyber world. And if we find something missing, yes, we should write new pieces, but it will be painful because we have different ideological, political approaches. And that's why what also Lassina said, confidence building measures, capacity building measures, political norms, rule of responsible state behavior have their role. That's where we can come together and we can work together. So sorry, Marc, if I did not answer directly your question, but I wanted to reflect on what others have said so far. Thank you.
I'm glad you did. Let's continue like that. Lassina or Mohammed, any comments on what has been said?
Marc, if you allow me, I just wanted to follow on what Marina said to say, she talked about the sub-regional context, the international context with regard to inclusiveness, as all of us mentioned. But what is key is science diplomacy at national level. This happened in the developed world. But if you take many of the African countries or the developing countries, as Marina said, people are not talking in the same room or from the same, or taking things from the same perspective. Scientists are doing their own thing, and when policymakers are going to international conferences, They're not involving the scientists in the discussion that they're taking up when they move internationally. And that's a problem. I'll give you an example in the UN system, even at the CTBT, where I've served for 18 years, nearly 2 decades. When you look at the mission, the international mission that are based in an international or accredited to the international organization, most of them in Geneva or Vienna or New York are discussing scientific issues. But very few missions from the developing world have scientific advisors attached to their mission, where they can take up issue to the detail that will be accepted in a way what they're there to global norms. And what is this, what the shortcoming this is bringing? 10 years later, people might be more aware of the issue, and then the country will have a different position because they will say, no, even if we accepted 10 years ago, today we can't, because there is this aspect that we didn't know before. And that's why I'm talking not only about inclusiveness to be there, but capacity development, capacity building, and interaction at a point where people know exactly what is being discussed and what impact it has nationally, domestically, before it was, because it can be brought globally. I think that is key. I've seen it for so many years in doing the negotiation and the discussion on the CTBT, and issues that were assumed to be agreed upon 20 years ago are now a problem, because those who are accepted with a different government are now having a knowledge that is not suitable for the government policy, 20 years later. So this is what I wanted to add to what Marina said. Thank you.
That's very, very interesting. Mohammed, would you like to maybe add some points on the international front?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so this is evolving into a wonderful discussion. So we can see that the impact of these new and emerging technologies, it's becoming more transboundary now. So which is why you need more states to come together. And on the element of competition, it's becoming more complex. So there are more stakeholders. Scientific mobility has increased, at a drastic rate. So scientists, they carry their own, values with them wherever they go. And if you look at the international level, there are already science advice mechanisms. So there is a need to, improve the efficacy of those science advice mechanisms. If you consider biotechnology at the UN level, there are at least 9 protocols or conventions that are directly or indirectly regulating biotechnology. So there's a wealth of, regulatory regimes that we have created, but there is a now need to utilize science diplomacy, as, all of us have said that, we need to be in the same room. But that also means that we have to evaluate that are the existing science advice mechanism actually delivering those science advice. If you look at the discussions related to cybersecurity in the UN, related to biotech under the Cartagena Protocol or the WTO, there are different values that are being discussed. So how do we bring together all of those people, and how do we evaluate the mechanisms? I think those are important considerations in going forward.
Anyone, any comments on what has been said so far? Any reactions you would like to put forward? Otherwise, I do have more questions, but give you a chance to react.
I mean, one area where I would like to see a bit more of a discussion is what has to change in the social norms. And that could be discussed internationally, but needs to be enforced in each country. And one central element, I think, is going to be difficult, but we need to push forward, is increased transparency. That means companies which are being sloppy about how they do things in the IT sector and AI, they really need to change their game here. It's important for internal reasons. They're already documenting a lot of their things. Larger companies, they have to do that. But there's another reason, which is the public, or some people representing the public, need to have access to some of that information to be able to see problems coming before they have a large social impact that could be negative. And it's going to be a change of culture. There's a culture of trade secrets and privacy of the code and so on. In the private sector, at least in academia and open source communities, it's a different story. But that change is absolutely needed. We already have something like this, as I said earlier, in other areas. So again, think about how careful companies have to document what they're doing in areas like transportation or pharmaceuticals. So yeah, there's a culture change that needs to happen, and both governments and companies need to come to terms with that.
One thing which happened since you mentioned pharma, is a lot of the standards, let's say good laboratory practices, documenting procedures, happened after a problem, after something happened. Now, there's one example I have for disclosure, which is maybe not a reaction to a problem, is the invention of patents. Patents were invented because people kept secrets. To give people an incentive to disclose in exchange to a temporary ownership. So I'm just wondering, between these two ideas, the reaction to the accident and patching it, and the idea of opportunity for private sector, is there something that needs to be invented, or do we just need more capacity, as Lassina indicated? Well, what's the mechanism to get to greater transparency?
The mechanism, as I said, it already exists because it's used in other sectors. There are aspects of the work that's being done that are known to be sensitive and that need to be documented. For example, how data sets for AI are constructed, how the data was selected, how it was filtered, in what degree is representative of what populations and things like this. We know what the questions are. The experts are starting to apply that on their own, but we need rules that say, these are it's like a list of questions you have to put down when you create a data set that's going to be used for producing a product that's going to be deployed to a large number of people. It doesn't mean that when you do research, you have to do all these things, or when you're exploring, but when you're building something that's going to have a social impact, this is really important. And one thing I want to say about transparency is it's a tool for prevention, because as I think one of the questions that was raised earlier, you mentioned, Marc, is whether regulation can keep pace with the technological evolution. And there's always going to be a problem there. So my view on this is to reduce that gap. You want to force more transparency, because now you can have somebody raise the alarm well before something bad happens. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's always going to work, but at least you have the possibility of doing it. And also just the fact that a company is forced to write these things down, it kind of forces their hand to think about the consequences. And so even if only a fraction of the documents were watched by a sort of a state representative or regulator, the fact that these are written down means there could be legal consequences if you're aware that there's a problem because you wrote it down, that there is this issue, and then you don't do anything about it. You're much more likely to be found guilty of misconduct than if you could claim you didn't know. So transparency is going to be a very important tool to help keeping pace. But I think there are other things that we can use from a prevention perspective. So one that I mentioned in my write-up is maybe slightly in contradiction to what Marina said earlier. So of course we need to be clear, but sometimes we can't be completely clear because we don't know what the problems could be, or the technology is moving too quickly. So what can we do? Well, we can try to put down norms that are a little bit more abstract, more like principles. And then the consequences of having these more abstract principles is it'll be more difficult for a company or a regulator to know, is it okay or not? And it's going to take back and forth, maybe through courts or through problems happening and so on. until we converge. But at least the principle is established, and people of good faith will try to plan according to that. And that means looking forward in time and avoiding the problems before they happen. The other thing that could help even change the mentality is have governments incentivize good behavior that happens before problems show up. So we tend to think of governments as like punishing the companies or organizations that are not following the rules of regulation. But we can also think of rewarding those that do good things that are better aligned with the protection of the public and so on. And right now, instead of seeing the opposition between the profit motive and protection of the public, I think we could have something that's going to be a better incentive for companies to behave in the way that's better aligned with public good.
Okay, well, thank you. Reactions to what Joshua just proposed?
Marc, if you wanna, I want to react to what Joshua said. I take it that it's true. Transparency is a tool for prevention, and I fully agree with Joshua. But at the same time, clear information, education, and clear practices, and in best practices as well, can be a tool for harmony and inclusiveness. To answer your question where you say, what do we need for science diplomacy to really take off? I think that's what we need. I'll give two examples. If you take this pandemic, I'm talking to colleagues, people I've gone to school to who are still in Africa right now, who just don't want to take the vaccine because they don't have clear information. Whether they should go for AstraZeneca, whether they should go for Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer, they just don't have clear information. I was talking to somebody this morning, and the person was telling me, while the pandemic is severe in his country, the person said, no, I'm waiting for Johnson because I heard that AstraZeneca and Moderna are not good. But why it's not good, the person can't tell me why. Likewise, if I go into a field that I'm more familiar with, nuclear energy, for a long period of time, they've been telling the developing world to not go for nuclear energy because it's not safe, because it's dangerous, to a point where people have had the confusion between a nuclear bomb and the nuclear energy that can serve development. So what's happening? Scientists have proven today that at a certain scale, solar energy that they've developed in the whole of the developing countries, especially in Africa, produce more carbon than a safe nuclear energy when you talk about small modular reactors. So, but who is aware of that? We need government advice and science advice to understand this, for government to embark in nuclear energy that could be safe, that could be, I would say, climate friendly as well when we talk about climate change, to kick off development in Africa and many of the countries that are in need of energy for industrialization. And this is what I wanted to give as a reaction, to not go into IT where Joshua has certainly more knowledge than I do. But I think it goes the same for cybersecurity and many other issues in artificial intelligence, cybercrime, and security as well, because we're dealing with security in the Sahel region where I'm from. And I think there are many, many aspects where science advice can make a huge difference, provided that we give clear information, we educate people. And education today shouldn't be training people to all have a PhD. They just need clear information, clear guidance, and how to behave and how to react when they face global challenges.
Thank you. Either Marina or Mohammed, any comments on this point?
Yes, happy to say something. What Lassina said about education and the need for information, crucial. And I think today when we are discussing the use of ICTs, we also know how big role this information is playing nowadays. So on one hand, we have the benefits of the use of ICTs, but at the same time, we have also new challenges. And so much disinformation about pandemic and COVID and the vaccines and the medications, you can find lots out there in social media and online. So it's a new one of the challenges that we have. very much agree with awareness, because in the end, we're talking about AI, and we need consumers who can make informed decisions. It's not easy. And again, I come from a country where we start educating kids from the first grade, 7 years old, and we end the education when people die. So my 96-year-old mother is still part of the educational program. It's expensive, it's not affordable to everybody, and we have to make it affordable, we have to make it accessible to everybody, to have informed consumers, informed people. And my final point is about trust, because in the end, we need a new form of trust. We started with different companies. Again, I'll bring an example. My country fell under cyber attacks 2007. Part of those attacks were attacks about private banks. And those banks came together and started exchanging information among themselves and with government, because it was useful for them, they benefited from that, and I think that at some point we need more trust within private sector, we need more trust between government, private sector, because in the end, governments are buying services from private sector owns critical infra and so on. We need more trust towards citizens and from citizens. So it's also very much a question of trust.
Thank you. Mohammed, would you like to add something to these points?
Yes, absolutely. So the phenomenon of technological convergence, that is also going to impact both regulations and how the element of transparency. So we also need to look at what kind of technological future that, consumers and states are looking forward to. And also the element of how science that, works out in the lab versus what goes out to the market. So there are different, compounding elements as well, disinformation and, how the profit motive versus, the interests of the scientist. These are the aspects which need to, be discussed better. Technological convergence, one of the benefit of it is that it will bring together scientists with different experiences. So let's say nano and bio, AI and bio, people with different experiences will come together. So the mechanisms that we're looking for, they already exist. It's just about, evaluating what mechanism is working and just go forward with it. We don't need to reinvent, new mechanisms and new structures. Look at what's working. And as Lassina has also said, the element of nuclear is the same with biotech as well. The myths that are circulated about GM crops and, with gene editing, it has impacted food security. So the benefit that is lost out to developing countries, those are the aspects that needs to be highlighted, using different platforms. And this is what I foresee is going to happen. So if we are going to future-proof or, bring forward a new element of regulations, it will involve inclusiveness, and that will come through bringing together people from different domains, and it is already happening.
Thank you. I believe our host would like to say something. Do we have a time warning or something? So just go ahead.
No, I can conclude. So, yeah, okay.
How much time do we have left? I should just ask you.
I see 2 minutes, 8 seconds.
Oh, okay. Then could we just give everyone a chance to say make a last wrap-up comment? Yeah? Joshua would like to, we have a very little time, but something that you would like to insert at this point.
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention, or I mentioned very briefly, is that in addition to regulation being seen as something to prevent harm, I think governments have other roles to promote the good use of technology by providing incentives for behavior or investments or developments that are good for the public. They can do it fiscally, they can do it in various, grants and so on. And it's like the other side of the coin, which we haven't talked about. But I think in terms of government intervention, you have to remember they can play on both sides.
Yeah, policy instruments of the whole kit. Thank you. Marina, conclusions?
Well, coming from the European Parliament, when we talk about multi-stakeholders and inclusiveness, we usually talk about government, private sector, academia, IT people, yeah? I'd like to add one more category, politicians. Because the sooner you start talking to us, the better we understand the problem. And I think that we also have to be much more open-minded and talk much more to other stakeholders. So that's the lesson I learned from today's discussion. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Lassina, please.
I will come back to what Marina said about trust. Trust is key. And then for politicians to be able to talk among themselves and then come to conclusion, they need to build trust among themselves. So science advice is key when we're discussing technological issue, be it artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nuclear test ban, as an example, and then many others. For global governance and regulatory science, this is key. Trust is key. And then trust comes with inclusiveness, and trust comes with transparency, and transparency comes with education, and education comes with, global issue brought at national level to a point where people have clear guidance. And that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. A great connection between the issues. Mohammed, please.
Yes, so endorsing what has been said earlier, I'll just say that science diplomacy as a platform can really help states as well as international institutions to bring scientists, politicians, and all stakeholders together. So we should hone it, nurture it, use capacity building programs, use education to bring together stakeholders and see what societies and states want from technology at the end of the day. That should be the yardstick for our regulatory standards. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just would like to take 20 seconds for thanks, if I may. First to the panelists for being very disciplined. It's really actually so easy to moderate when people have such great manners and also your clarity. I think we have some real positive results in the context of a big challenge, of course. I also would like to say thanks to Christian Allen and Grant Mills at INGSA for organizing. And finally, to Rémi Quirion, the Chief Scientist of Quebec, for hosting the INGSA event. So thanks very much.
Marina Kaljurand said it with great conviction at the beginning of this panel. We need clarity. So thank you very much to our moderator and panelists for this enlightening discussion. From September 7 to 9, INGSA has partnered with a range of organizations who will host satellite events. These are opportunities to further deepen and expand your engagement with the issues at the science, policy, society interface across many different topics. Visit INGSA2021.org for more details.